minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Kush'S Korner here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, the coolest reptile network in the world. Tonight, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Mr. Rob Stone of High Plains Herp to talk about not only his recent trip to Australia, but everything else that he is doing in the industry, the stuff that he has kept historically, currently, his rhino rat projects, you name it. We're going to hit on it tonight. But as always, first of all, USARC. So USARC is the organization that is fighting for our rights to keep our reptiles, to run our reptile businesses, and to live this lifestyle that we all love to so much. Check out usarc.org for all the information you need to know about the organization. And if you are not already a member of USARC, I would highly suggest you look into becoming a member. As a community, we have strength in numbers, so the more people that are behind the cause, the better. And we are brought to you tonight by Gary Scavino of GS Reptiles, one of the leaders in the field of green tree pythons, emerald tree boas, carpet pythons, Boland's pythons, Sanzinia, you name it in the arboreal world. Gary is your guy. He also has one of the absolute best reptile-related YouTube channels. Check out GS Reptiles on YouTube and check out Gary on all forms of social media. He also frequently has some of the highest end arboreals available as well if you are lucky enough to be able to get an animal from Gary. So check out, as always, Gary Scavino of GS Reptiles. And we're also brought to you by the Reptile Perch. David Brahms is the person who innovated the 3D printed reptile perch system for both tubs and for cages. There have been many copycats since, but he is the original. Check out the reptileperch.com for all of your 3D printed tub and cage perch needs. He also breeds high-end green tree pythons as well. So if you are in that market, you can also find his green tree pythons on the website as well. Again, thereptileperch.com. And last but certainly not least, we are brought to you by Brian Susan of SUNDOWN Reptiles, one of the leaders in the fields of rare geckos, tree monitors, green tree pythons, Obronia, the list goes on. Brian is one of the absolute best professional breeders in the current age of the reptile industry, producing some of the highest quality animals in the entire United States. If any of those species were of interest to you that I had listed previously, check out sundownreptiles.com or Sundown Reptiles on all different forms of social media. And here we are. Thank you to everybody who is tuned in tonight. Back with another guest this week after a solo episode last week. So I'm very excited to talk to Rob. Many of you are probably familiar with Rob from his many appearances on Morelia Python Radio or from the Reptile Fight Club podcast. So probably a lot of you guys already are very familiar with Rob, but I know we'll get into some new topics tonight, that's for sure. But before that, for all of us here at the Trap Talk Reptile Network, please subscribe on YouTube if you are here with us on YouTube, either live or after the fact. Shout out to all the current live listeners who are in the chat. Very much appreciated. But if you are one of our audio people on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Buzzsprout, any of those audio platforms, a subscribe and a 5-star rating would mean the world to us. And there is a new podcast every single day of the week here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network. So if you're looking for that reptile podcast content, you have come to the right place. There is never a shortage of it here. Shows from some of the absolute best hosts in the game, covering a wide variety of topics. So the content is never stale. There's always something new and exciting going on over here at the channel. But with all that good stuff out of the way, let's get Rob on the show. How's it going, man?
That's great. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was a shame we couldn't link up a few months ago when you guys were out here in Old West Texas. That seemed like a pretty cool trip.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it was wound up being Phil and I, because Brandon and Dustin Gron went a week
Yeah.
early, decided to short circuit that. But
When I saw
good.
this guy comment, I feel like, I was like, this has to come up in the first 5 minutes of the show, because this is they showed me the document that you sent them, and while your handwriting is really poor, the dates were there. So I was like,
I think it was mostly optimism. So Brandon couldn't do it with the conflicts around Daytona in terms of time off and things. And so I think it was the hopeful optimism that, it must be this, which was sort of the initial iteration from the end of last year, kind of trying to foreplan it through the year, which was then super funny when I sent Dustin that this year for the coming year. I said, hey, let's still make sure we double check on the dates and all. But yeah, so no, it was good. And so Phil and I came out and had a great time. Found the Lep at Iran, and so that made the whole trip worthwhile. We didn't get to see the sub-ox that those guys did. They found maybe a greater breadth of stuff than we did, but I found the one thing that I really wanted to see. So
yeah, I mean, rock rattlesnakes, to me, seeing them in the wild, that's a different level compared to some of the others. I mean, everything that you see is obviously cool, but only one for me this year ran into a Lep in the Wacos, and just that moment when you actually realize, oh my gosh, I actually finally found that snake. It's a special one.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, especially a Waco. Have you looked for Waco Alterna? Talk about some, hard enough to find and then trying to double it down.
Not only really one time, and that was actually with Brandon and Dustin. We were out there trying to get, sub-ox, Alterna, hognose, but
sure.
Not to say just rattlesnakes. We got a couple Western Diamondbacks, and Brandon might remember better than me. It may have been a Mojave, or maybe like a Mojave Western hybrid, if that's even a thing. It looks strange to us. Sure. And then the blacktail, that was really the highlight of the night. The Ornatus, that was right. Really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. So yeah, I mean, and that just seems. So I've never been explicitly in that habitat. It's just pretty dry and desolate, right?
I mean
it's pretty unforgiving, even for West Texas, right?
Yeah, it depends on where you go. There are little pockets here and there, but for the most part, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's it definitely, it's a lot more spread out where the really like dense, good habitat is. But when you can find it, it's really interesting. At least also to see that this kind of habitat actually exists in the middle of the desert. Like out in the Waco Mountains in particular, there's a lot of like natural pool formations and whatnot that, during the summer you could be out there hiking and there's an accumulation of water like that's fairly significant. I'm like, this is really neat. You wouldn't really think this if you were just on the road looking at the mountains from a distance that this would be here.
Interesting. Yeah, so we can come back to this later, but that reminds me of this most recent Australia trip. There was actually a point with sort of that same point, but okay. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. How is the access out there? Because I know that's really kind of the definitional West Texas problem is public access, right?
Yeah, so I mean, as of now, I'm pretty new out here still. I've primarily been going on to public land that I know is absolutely public land, because that's the problem with Texas. If you get that wrong, the consequences could be dire. And sure. I'm definitely not trying to get shot, especially on a day where I don't find anything, because that would be the most tragic. You end up stepping on some private land, taking a shotgun shell, and you don't find a snake either. That would be awful. So yeah, that's definitely the problem with Texas, 100%.
Yeah. So I've now been there 3 times, and yeah, so we finally worked through, got that rattlesnake, and have certainly found cool stuff. But I guess maybe that's been some of my frustration with the West Texas thing. It's cool. Yeah. I do like the sort of culture around it, right? It's the only place I've ever been where just the driving around with that orange vest is an indicator of exactly what you're doing. And the funny thing is, even if you go a little bit east, so if on the second trip, we were headed back towards San Antonio, and we were maybe an hour and a half east of Sanderson,
Okay.
maybe 2 hours, something like that. And we were shining some cuts, and it was very clear that no one had any idea what we were doing. So it's really that super localized Big Bend up to, Fort Van Horn, something like that, over to Sanderson and maybe a bit east and up to Iran, maybe. But yeah, it's that small pocket where I don't think anywhere else people would just automatically infer, oh, they're out looking for reptiles.
So I actually don't know what you're talking about. And I bet a lot of people who are listening probably don't either. What is this phenomenon that you are speaking of?
So in the in the late 90s, I believe it became illegal to road cruise in Texas, at least in theory, right? So that if Parks and Wildlife was watching
Yeah.
and you watched you pull over, and you could theoretically stand on the side of the road and wait for the snake to crawl off the road to be on
Yeah.
that easement, and then you're okay. But in Texas, you can't cruise the road for snakes, theoretically based on our own safety, which is also why you're required to wear the orange safety vests when you're out and about.
Got it.
But yeah, so for the most part, people follow that because, again, especially different times of year and in those areas, it is such a known thing that they're watching closely. So mostly what it entails, again, Texas style, rather than following the contours of the earth, the approach was to blast holes through mountains and hillsides that appeared, which creates these, it's a lidless tunnel, basically, that the road serves as. And for the most part, herping in West Texas involves going at night and with a flashlight and walking along what are referred to as cuts. And you have to do so, as I say, wearing an orange reflective vest. And it's not that exciting, especially when you don't find stuff, as you say. And a lot of those areas get big semis that come through, and those roads aren't all that big. So even when we found that lepidus, I found it, and then one was barreling through there. And so I explicitly told Phil, essentially, he had heard me exclaim something, and I was concerned that he would he would be concerned and try to come to me. And I was like, nothing, stay there, wait for this big semi to come through. And then here's what we're looking for. Yeah, so.
Interesting. So yeah, I really, from here, I've typically gone west into New Mexico and into Arizona because I actually haven't herped in that area. So good to know for when I decide to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huh.
There's cool stuff out there for sure, but yeah, it's even, man, just public access stuff. There's basically the Big Bend National Park. There's Davis Mountain State Park. Those public road, but that's why, for the most part, alternate localities within Texas beyond the Wacos are referenced by those road cuts. That some people poke fun at that and all those things, but the reason for that is because that's the accessible habitat.
Yeah, that is true. That is a good point. Be a real shame that it is, but what can you really do? There's a lot of private land out here. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think, so a lot of, there are herpers with private land there. And then there are relationships, right, that have been developed over time, both positively and negatively associated with that. So there are, sometimes you can connect with locals. I'm sure you'd have an easier time of it being about 3 hours out or whatever, to get access to that private land, which gives you just so much more opportunity, and it's a lot more fun to go wander in bush than it is to be standing there on the side of the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely get that. Brandon added another little piece of West Texas about what cops like to do if you're doing a recon mission for Rob out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, and there's a ton of Border Patrol. And that's interesting. Arizona, there is in Arizona as well. When it's really on in Texas, though, it seems more intrusive than in Arizona. That being said, wearing the vest and all, it's generally speaking a quick trip for us, or quick stop or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, that is. Are they ever trying to like check permits or stuff like that? Or are they really just trying to make sure you're a citizen and moving on?
Yeah, it's especially Border Patrol. It's that. Occasionally you'll get, hey, did you find anything tonight? And and it's unclear whether that's where that would go. Depending on if you
Oh, you
said sure. Yeah, there's a ton of commercial collecting out there, especially in certain seasons. So when the middle trip, we had gone in June, and there were folks out there that were just everything that was alive was going in a bucket.
yeah.
And that's a huge bummer, especially when you happen to be like winding up at the same spots. I'm still pretty confident that I could have seen a lepidus at Davis Mountain State Park on my second trip. That a group had one in a bucket, and sure looked like a Davis critter, and we'd come up behind them and they were being super strange, and I'm pretty sure that oh, we just found it in the parking lot here. And it
Right.
was like, no, I'm pretty sure you found that 4 hours ago when we were about 5 minutes behind you on the trail. So
Yeah. That's a shame.
yeah, so I mean, it just sort of is what it is, I guess, and a
Yeah.
bummer, but got us another trip, got me a great experience with Phil. So yeah, all good.
Yeah. Do you have any like new targets or targets you have not hit for like a future trip out this way?
Yeah, absolutely. So that area is actually better known for the Trans-Pecos copperheads. So we
Right.
were hoping that was that same spot. Ken produced those, and so we were hopeful on that. Brandon and Dustin found one at a different spot. Jealous of them for that. I'm kind of so going back to I really started going to Australia in 2018. That was the first time I'd been there. I traveled, but not to Australia and not for herping. And I going to Australia that year really got me excited for it, and it had taught me I think what really actually fed it was, so at that point we'd spent from 2011, so 7 years of NPR talking about Australian pythons, and on our in anticipation, right? Everybody, both in the U.S. and who had been to Australia, and the Australians were like, "Oh, we'll tell you, whenever you come, we'll show you around. We'll teach, show you everything, all this
Yeah.
cool stuff, and all that. You can rely on us." And our first trip, well, we definitely got some helpful tips and tricks and things. Um, Ultimately, it became very clear that a key in herping is the ability to pivot and have not just a singular plan, but based on weather conditions or access or whatever it might be, the ability to, in a moment, say, okay, I know, okay, we're here, we're trying to do this. This isn't working out. Let's pivot to this.
Sure.
We definitely didn't have that in 2018 when Eric and Chris Salemi and I went.
Got it.
And it taught me that, especially just relative to my own sort of nature, that I wanted to learn to prepare. And frankly, that became a lot of the fun, is that preparation and trying to figure things out and make a plan, and have a really solid plan. So it's really been 5 years. Of course, we were going to go, as everybody that, right, they had their spring 2020 big plans. Our big plan was we were going to go to Western Australia to try and find Morelia spilota imbricata or Morelia imbricata, the
Wow.
southwestern carpet. And had a lot of good ideation. Seeing there's stellatus that are out there, go up to Shark Bay. So many cool species, right? Iconic things. On our first trip in 2018, we'd gone to Cairns and Brisbane, and so that was really good. But as I say, it was mostly about learning and saying, okay, not necessarily to some extent that area, right? In terms of that's the difficulty. You can go to a spot, and it almost feels like you have to at least go once more because of how much you learned the first time you go. But really,
Sure.
that 2018 trip was like, never again am I going to rely on folks to tell me where to go. I'm going to figure it out and have a plan and the ability to kind of pivot from moment to moment. Spring 2020, as I say, we actually got lucky that we hadn't left. It was close enough on that end where we could have wound up in, there was whatever, the movie The Guy Who Lives at the Airport or whatever, and that that wouldn't have been great. So we managed to not leave, and so not get either stuck in transit or stuck over there or whatever. And it was like, well, what are we going to do now? And thought was, well, we like rattlesnakes are cool. How about we make the goal trying to find all the forms of crotalus that are in the U.S.
Yeah.
So as of and that was actually then that fall turned into the first West Texas trip. So
Okay.
in October 2019, we went to West Texas, drove down. Justin Julander drove to my house, and then Eric and Owen flew to my house, and then we all drove down to Sanderson from there. Had a short trip and learned a lot, but did see one Atrox. So October 2019, got an Atrox, had seen prairie rattlesnakes in Colorado. So yeah, as of October 2019, I was at 2 of what I call 27 U.S. crotalus forms. And as of today, I'm at 24 of 27.
Wow.
So we're, that became the goal. And of course, once you get close on the end, especially there's a really hard one down your way, or relatively your way.
4 hours, half hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I haven't actually tried for that one yet. I've been within an hour and a half of there, but haven't tried for that. But that's definitely on the agenda for this year to give that one a go.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're
special one.
Yeah, for sure. So
the other
go ahead.
What are the other 2 rattlesnakes? You have Obscurus.
Yeah, kind of interesting, right? It's always interesting what winds up being the last one. The northern Pacific rattlesnake and a true canebrake rattlesnake, so a southern form timber. So I've seen a handful of northern timbers, but calling those different, kind of in the forms rather than defined species or subspecies or whatever. And mostly then that's been, those are not places that I've prioritized. So that's to me, the interesting thing about herping to a list. And Justin Nipper and I are going to have a fight club on this topic. And then there's another guest that we're trying to get on to kind of present even more of a view to that. Somebody who's gone through and has accomplished, actually, I believe has accomplished that crotalus forms goal. We haven't worked through the list and said, okay, what are you counting that I'm not counting, and vice versa. But the cool thing about that is it gives you some purpose and ideation, right? So our idea for going to West Texas in the fall of 2020, I think I was saying 2019. No, we went to Australia again in 2019 to the NT. Saw 5 of the 6 top end pythons. Saw everything but an olive python.
Wow.
So it was when I said fall 2019 for West Texas, that was fall of 2020, October 2020. And the other than that, which was just people like going to West Texas, so I guess we'll herp West Texas and see what that's all about. Then it became okay, we saw an Atrox, let's go from there. And the cool thing with the list is it's like, well, it kind of suggests the next place, right? Or amongst next places. And that could be, I think, the next June, right? So we'd gone October to 2020. It was unseasonably cold. It was kind of like, man, if we were a week earlier, that would have been better. It's a little hard to plan that when you have to be a little more regimented with when you're taking time off and flights and all that stuff, as opposed to just driving over. So you kind of, you try your best to pick a good season. I love a shoulder season, but kind of between seasons that are changing. And so we went with the ideal time, June 2021, and that wound up being maybe a week or 2 weeks early. I think Chris Painshaub's Alterna was in July of that year. So there were certainly a bunch of herpers, but maybe we were then a little bit early. Then this year we went in August, which I think was pretty good timing. But just trying different times, different places, different things. But it's feel free to redirect. But those are some of the ideas.
No, I do. I love the stream of consciousness kind of conversation. I mean you have quite the task ahead of you with finding the Obscurus. That's I've been in theoretical range of Obscurus, but like one has been seen ever type of range of Obscurus. And I mean, I keep Willard eye, and considering how, I mean, they barely make a noise when they rattle. They're tiny. They blend in perfectly, especially with those gray Obscurus. I'm like, how the hell could anyone ever find one of these snakes? Like, it seems impossible. Right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that is one. I've definitely talked to folks that have seen one, although I think they consider they need to see another based on the state that it was in. So maybe that tells folks in the know who that would be. And then folks have seen them in Mexico, and obviously there's the huge project that, and that's sort of interesting. I think the Animist, right, would be more doable. It's just a question of public access. Even then, I'm not suggesting it's easy by any stretch. I'm just saying that's probably doable. And then the other thing, right, because I know Saunders, right, whatever his famous number, what he spent 500 days looking or whatever for to see one eventually. The downside of that is that probably includes days that it wouldn't be reasonable to see a snake, right? So it's kind of, what does that count really look like in terms of optimal days to where you would think this? At the same time, I'm having to pre-plan it and all that, so my likelihood of getting an optimal day, maybe the random, his random day count is more instructive for my attempt. So I don't know. There's definitely
500 days in a row, but for 200 of those days, you pulled into the parking lot, checked your phone, and then left.
Right.
Okay, sure. I guess you were there, but like you weren't.
Well, I think he was living out there, right, for a grad project or whatever, so at least it's like, I think he was just but that's the point, is he's got nothing better to do. You might as well look, so that's a day that, like, but is that really a day? I don't know. I'm sure he has his own mixed feelings on that, or what those numbers could be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what are your thoughts on the validity of Obscurus as a species to begin with?
Right. Yeah, I know. So when we come down, Phil and I come down, Phil knows Kyle. And so we had gone to Kyle's place, and I asked him, we were talking about it and stuff. And certainly, he has way more experience with those critters than I do. And I don't think he was a super fan of the project in terms of sort of what was going on with that. And I can understand where he'd be coming from with that, not to put words in his mouth, but I think he felt passionately enough about it that I don't mind mentioning it. So just kind of a contrary opinion, right? Because there's so much that's been positive, and as everything, right, there's everything's a mixed bag probably to some extent. So I haven't looked at beyond read. So the Snakes of Arizona book is awesome, and I certainly have read that extensively in terms of those. The rattlesnakes, the big rattlesnakes volumes, there's a lot in there about them. From Dave Barker, who had studied them down in Mexico. I think the interesting thing, right, was sort of the backstory on that description, at least as I understood it from Dave's text, was that it suggested that someone had access to, I think, the Animist population, and maybe had been collecting them in the late 70s. And then after having done so to kind of prevent other people from having that access or ability to collect them, had proposed them as something that should be recognized as distinct, and kind of been involved with the naming process and stuff. So as sometimes happens with herp stuff, right, there are politics at play and different things. So that was super interesting. I don't really know the story as to that. Dave talks about it a little bit in that text, and implies a lot. And certainly he was around, and had a lot of exposure to the species. So I trust that. But certainly they don't look like, Arizona willardi, for sure. At least, they
look like a lot of Silas.
Well, and I think that's the point, right?
Some Silas side by side, and do like the blind wine taste test, and you're not passing that with any sort of regularity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I suppose for my pursuit, right, at least relative to the sort of that smaller list of saying U.S. crotalus forms, it sort of doesn't matter. Absolutely. Because they're not Arizona willardi, and they're in the U.S., or at least they're barely clinging on. So relative to having to find them, it doesn't really matter. And I suppose kind of either way, if the lesser version would be seeing them in Mexico, which does sound super doable. I mean, relative to that project, they found a lot of snakes. The interesting thing to me about that was when they had gone, it was earlier than I would have thought. So I don't know quite what to make of that, and if the habitat's just the biogeographic habitat in terms of seasonality or whatever is that different.
What time was it? What time of year?
I think it was July.
Huh. That in in New Mexico.
In Mexico.
Oh, in Mexico. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, from what I understand.
I would just think kind of the back end of August into September to me would be more in New Mexico, would be more when I would
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
that that's not necessarily right, but just in terms of like to find a lot of, I don't know, it must
Yeah.
be really good habitat as opposed to sort of the remnant barely hanging on stuff that's in New Mexico, I guess was sort of the idea. Anyway, so yeah, that's
Yeah.
sort of the strategy, and we'll see,
Sure.
see if we can kick one up. I know.
Yeah, I say that not to diminish the project or the species or whatever. I think it's an interesting conversation to have, and it's it's kind of like taxonomy in a nutshell, in a case study that's really close to us as Americans. But nonetheless, that population of snakes in that part of the country is incredible and worth preserving and worth researching. So whether or not Obscurus is distinctive from Silas or whatnot, that takes nothing away from those actual animals and the actual scenario in those mountains. So
Yeah, totally. No, I'm with you. So maybe as you highlight, if the list as it, so I've looked for Northern Pacifics once last year, and it
okay.
was a little bit early. It was in March, mid-March, and that just sort of aligned with, availability of time and whatever. And it was cool. It was probably in the low 60s. It was sunny. It felt really good. It felt very rattlesnakey. Felt like the habitat where I'd seen. Well, I'd failed to see. They were definitely moving. There's one spot that's on the Pacific Crest Trail, where on our first trip to Southern California, we tried to find Helleri, and the bummer of that, even at that early time of year, is that there were just so many people going through that area that invariably it would be, would come upon a group and they're like, oh, we just saw one, that was X amount back, and who knows whether that's even right or whatever. We did have, Brandon went with Eric and I to, in March, and, or maybe, no, ours was April. It was March the first time we went. So,
Okay.
So in April, saw a Helleri with Brandon. Brandon found that at a spot that he was like, yeah, ideated, said, let's do this after some failed ventures, after failing at that PCT spot that we'd gone the previous time in March. I believe it was March that first time. But anyway, distracted from the Northern Pacific thing, which was, we went in March. It looked good. It felt like that same habitat, but they just weren't out. And sure enough, we were probably 10 days early, something like
Sure.
that. So again, speaking to pre-planning / when your availability is or whatever. And cane breaks, basically I spent one night with Nipper, Phil, I think KJ was with us, and Eric
Okay.
in North Florida,
Yeah.
in a spot where you can find them. But realistically, it was one night and it dropped the kind of the same thing. We were probably a week late, although the weather was unseasonably cold for that kind of end of the first week. And that was in 2023. We did kick up a pine snake. I did see a coral snake. Didn't get a picture, so that means it's still something it's about finding it and getting a picture. So
Yeah.
still things to work on. But yeah, so that's kind of that. So associated with going on those trips, finding different things, the U.S. Crotalus has turned into, that had shifted to U.S. rattlesnakes, including the Cistrus form, 7 of those by my count. And then now it's just become all U.S. venomous. And I think I'm at something like 70% of all the U.S. venomous at this point. So
cool. Do you have a particular spot that you would like to find your cane break, or just kind of where you can get it?
Yeah, I'd love to see one of those prototypes, right? So where it's got the purples with the strong orange stripe to it. As I say, having seen timbers, which again, scientifically, right, at this point, the same thing. But so I wanted to look like that. So somewhere, certainly those South Carolina ones are beautiful. I wouldn't mind North Florida. I'm going to give that a go just first in the year, because I'd love to see a Simus. And so that puts us in a close-ish enough spot to, because yeah, then it turns into finding other things. I want to see all the Pituophis. I want to see all the Heterodon. So yeah, that's the cool thing, right? Is just starting from saying we couldn't go to Australia. Let's find U.S. Crotalus. As you start working through that, going on those trips, encountering and interacting with different animals, it becomes, okay, now I want to add this and add this and add this. And it's sometimes that means you got to come back to that same spot. Hey, we used the knowledge that we picked up this time. Other times it means, oh yeah, I'll go to North Florida, even though that isn't necessarily my favorite place to be.
It's not a great vacation, but there's some cool snakes there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and heck, I mean, really, just going up for Carpet Fest every year, that's turned into, so we found timbers, mountain timbers, found the coastal timbers or the lowland timbers. But I still haven't found a pine snake, a Pine Barrens pine snake. So that,
I have a friend out there who lives in New Jersey who's had just the worst time trying to, from what I understand, unless you know your spot and you guard it with your life, you might not be finding a pine snake up there in the Pine Barrens.
Yeah, I mean, I think between sort of old school ideation put us onto some spots that was interesting, and then this past trip just sort of not that spot, but sort of connected to that spot or close to that spot. I did come across tin that was covered in pine needles, and I'm pretty sure I know what they were trying to flip there in kind of that upland habitat. So that was interesting to find that, right? And so that gave some credence to that place, although man, the Northeast, so your friend who lives in Jersey, ticks and chiggers are not something I'm super used to, just because Colorado, so we have some of that stuff, but it's so dry that I think those mostly don't survive sort of in the wild state. Arizona is very similar. Utah apparently has a ton of different species, although I don't think on this last trip, actually, we did kick up some. Those are fun. We can go into how those actually work. After getting destroyed by them for a third time, I looked into what those actually do and how that works and what that process is, because it's like people are saying, oh, you can't see them, and I'm like, well, I'm seeing something, and then you just get totally wrecked. And so so we could talk about that too. But so the answer with that is sort of both. Is that chiggers go through, I think they have they have like a nymph, a larva, and an adult stage. And when they're larvae, you either can't, they're microscopic. You essentially can't see them. When they're larvae and adults, I mean, it depends on your vision, right? But certainly there are these little crawling orange dots that if you look close, if you're not moving, you look closely and whatever, you can find them. That was funny when we were going from a spot to, in the Pine Barrens, driving over to Delaware to see a copperhead for Justin's first one. Not this past year, but the year before. I got all these little orange things crawling on me, and I start throwing them out the window, and he's in the back seat behind me, and they're just coming behind my seat. So but I had taken off 125 of them in 2 hours, in the 2 hours or so that we were driving, and I'm like, well, what are these things, right? And they didn't have the adhesion even of an unstuck tick or whatever. So it's like, what's the answer? And the answer is that as larvae and adults, chiggers eat plants. So the thing that is biting you, yes, is microscopic and you can't see it, or it would take amazing eagle eyes to see it. So it's sort of both true. The thing that is actually causing your skin irritation is not visible, but you could see an adult chigger if you looked. So if you're in a spot like that spot with that tin, it was Eric and I that were out there, and I had taken a seat, which is always a risky proposition. I have become a pants herper. I was initially reluctant, but Southern California actually put me off of that for good, because just the cacti that happens out there is truly something else. And you only have to pull out, one cholla clump with 30 different spikes going into you at once to just say, like, yeah, maybe pants is a sell. It's really a bummer when you see the sort of livestock animals that are out there just wandering around with those things. That's pretty brutal. But anyway, despite the pants, I sat down at that spot in Jersey, and I pulled out my phone, and my phone is crawling in adult chiggers, and I was like, oh, this is not a good sign. because presumably the larvae are near where the adults are. And yeah, you just see them crawling all over the phone. So the larvae have a stygosome, which means so they attach to you, and essentially they put this little funnel down that starts digesting your skin. And the answer is really that unlike a tick where you have basically a day to get them off, the second that happens and they've released that juice, you're going to have the skin wound regardless. So that's, if you're in the country where they're at, you're just in it, man.
Yeah. No choice.
There's no retroactive fix in it or whatever. And it mostly shows up 2 to 3 days later when you just start itching like a maniac. And those things stick around for 3 to 4 weeks. You're going to feel that for a long time.
Jeez.
I don't understand how people live there. Speaking of your buddy living in Jersey, I don't get it. I don't understand it. You'll be at these spots and there's houses that are right on this stuff. And it's like how, people with dogs, that I'm sure they're taking ticks off those dogs every day.
Yeah, certainly. Jeez. Yeah, that's not fun. That's one of the things I like about herping out west is just, the bug situation is usually not all that bad. And so.
Yeah, absolutely. Combined with, just visibility, right? If you're, a lot of that some of the hill stuff's a little bit different, but yeah, I mean, you can just see forever, right? And there's not that much leaf litter doesn't help for herping, for sure.
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always like you find that little patch of leaf litter and like you fill your bag up like, oh shoot, here's some. I finally found some leaf litter. Like
yeah. For that, habitat type or whatever. Yeah. Whereas on the East Coast, it'll just be so dense, and often that means there's stuff coming with it, which isn't necessarily problematic for the animal. We could bacon racks in the oven or whatever, But it's definitely a challenge. So each place has their own challenge, and that's part of the fun of going to different spots too. I do love Arizona's great. The different areas in Arizona that we've been are great. Got a couple plans this year to try some different areas that I've been in similar stuff, but that'll be good. Really excited. The Grand Canyon was something. I know Dustin's talked about that a fair bit, but if you're going to find an abyssus, you might as well do it right and go to the bottom, and all good. So no question about that. And coming off a trip, on that same trip where we had folks disputing whether we had seen concolor, I guess, to put that one to bed or whatever, we certainly have seen them, but possibly there was one that at a minimum it has concolor in it. That was the first one that we had found that was beautiful with these sort of irregularities and things. That's on the Instagram that people could see. A little one, but we saw one that we were on road cruising up above Moab, and there's no alternative, right? The question is really, are they prairie rattlesnakes, prairie / Southwest Four Corners prairies, Hopis, whatever, or mixes. And that's San Juan County was where we were, and it was only later that it turned out that San Juan County is known historically. In that same Rattlesnakes book, it goes into great detail about how San Juan County, Utah, there's been a ton of dispute as to what those snakes are generally. So that probably, maybe the answer is that really I've seen 25 of 28 in the San Juan County, Utah, whatever that thing is its own one. That's not even a Hopi. It's something else, and that's caused clobber, a ton of confusion, and all this stuff. So, but anyway, we saw one above Moab, but it had been clipped right on the tail. That being said, it was very much alive, and it was one of just a little tiny neonate. I think it just come out of the rock, probably from having been born, over the previous winter. Yeah. And I was glad that I used a hook because it bit the crap out of the hook. And so, while generally speaking, I want them to be perfect, I count concolor as need a new picture, like the coral snake.
Sure.
Because what would I say then? What would the situation be? Is if I had used my hand and it bit the crap out of my hand, it would be like, well, I haven't seen concolor, but I've been bit by one. That wouldn't make much sense. So, to me, that's where we sit with that one. Is I'm planning to go this year and find at least one more and take lots of pictures, and that'll be the definitive one. But certainly, I've definitely seen one because were I not doing it properly, I would have been bit by one.
Yeah. That's it's always a scary situation when when you end up making the right choice, but then you see what the wrong choice would have been, happen right in front of you. It's like, oh shoot, this is what I'm coming out to do. Like, all right, this is a little bit of a sobering moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing to me, and I'm curious what your experience is with the ones that you have. The captive Willardi that I interact with generally have been very calm. And Clobberi generally are pretty riled up, at least most of the ones that I interacted with. And then my experience of it in the wild has been the reverse. So that the first Willardi that I saw, Justin Julander had found, and yeah, any notion of that, based on my prior experience, my captive experience would have been, oh, this is fine or whatever, and that thing would have been very happy to put a tooth into you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I have not found any Willardi forms in the wild, but yeah, my ones that I have here in the house, they're pretty chill, generally speaking. My Amabilis is definitely like jumpy when I enter the room, but is just really used to how I maintenance and whatnot. The Silas are all pretty chill, and I mean, I don't really think I've ever had a Clobberi that I found in the wild like strike and go
yeah
crazy.
That's the thing. All the wild Clobberi I've seen then have been pretty placid.
Yeah, they just
which is not a suggestion for folks, but just that's the interesting thing between those two, especially since they occur conspecifically, is my captive experience would have said, oh, Willardi will be fine and Clobberi will be wound up. And my experience has been inverted in the wild, where most Clobberi generally are pretty calm, and Willardi are so I've seen 3, and all of them have been super willing to put a tooth in you.
Yeah, I mean, I say that to also, I got to say too that most, if not all, of my Clobberi that I keep are also pretty well mannered as well. I don't really have a lot of rattlesnakes that are really looking to bite right away, unless it's like a feeding response bite. Some of the Mexican stuff, like the Polystictus or the Achilles or the San Luis Potosi animals, their feeding response is so high and they're so quick that like they'll move at you. But it's with most of them, it's always feeding response, and occasionally you'll get like a spooked animal that just starts running. But for the most part, I find that rattlesnakes get very accustomed to routine. More so than other snakes do, where like if you do the same thing with that rattlesnake over and over again, it'll just sit there and let it happen, and then bite the mouse when the mouse is in there, which is one of the things that I like so much about them, is just it seems like they really catch on to that type of thing, where some, especially like some like higher strung colubrids or whatnot, are always just kind of like wired, or like a white lip python or something. They don't really quite come down with that routine as much as the rattlesnakes do.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, I guess I should clarify, right? In all those instances with the Willardi in particular, none of those, as I can recall, were like upon initial encounter were particularly defensive, right? And it's not a question of where you would have walked on it and it would have been a risk or whatever. It's the presentation of a lens, and maybe they're seeing themselves in the reflection and flashing them and stuff like that. That then it's been the response to that, which again is not, I mean, right, good on them. It's the I really do it to highlight the contrast of saying like any notion that like, oh, these things are sweet based on my experience with captive animals, if that would lead you to not be sufficiently respectful of those wild ones, would have ended badly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then, I guess to emphasize people out there, treat every rattlesnake in said way.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that is surprising. And, I'm curious for myself when I eventually have the ability to see a Willardi, probably in Arizona first, to kind of compare and contrast that experience to what I experienced with Silas and whatnot here. So it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, that habitat's very cool. And not the issue, I'm sure, is just the ability to get away for you. But, and that's not super, it's doable, but it's not super close. So I know I totally can appreciate that.
4 to 5 hours or so, which is, that's a, good driving the night before, hit the mountain the next morning. But yeah, it's, I moved out here to get a lot more herping in, and have done significantly less than I ever anticipated. So, it's almost like you need, it's better to have that as a trip than like something you could do every weekend and then you just never do, because you could always do it next weekend. So, and then all of a sudden it's November and you're like, well, all right, I guess I'm waiting until April to do this. So
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if stuff's super local to you, then the advantage of that obviously is the ability to be really responsive to the weather, right? And say, oh, okay, this actually is a good night, fits with my schedule. Okay, I can get out there. 4 or 5 hours isn't necessary, I'm not as young as I once was. Brandon, he'll just keep going, right? And I will keep going, but mostly in the context of a trip.
You don't stop. That's that's the truth, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, no, I think there's something to that, but certainly for me, for the most part, the things that I need to see still are further afield. And so, yeah, the kind of planning out a trip and making it fit in, and then trying to pick it in a way that makes sense, right? I am a believer in lunar illumination. So the moon phase stuff that, in my opinion, the real advantage, less than the amount that it's illuminated, of herping when you in the full to new span, is that the moon doesn't even rise until at times after you'd be done. So when you're right on, like in that 3/4 to new, you're talking about the moon is, rising at 4 in the morning and then setting before it's actually dark. So there's no moon. The percentage of illumination is irrelevant relative to nocturnal critters because the moon isn't even up at that time of the month. So that's my suggestion. I do try and account for that. Obviously, it depends what you're looking for. If I'm looking for a Jersey Pine Barrens pine snake, then it doesn't really matter because I'm mostly, if not entirely, going to be looking, during the day. And there's really not much road cruising up that way. But if you're going to Australia and you only get to go once a year, once a lifetime, whatever it might be, then I would suggest people try and factor that in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great way to transition over to the Australia talk. So you said that the first time over to Australia kind of came with some trials and tribulations. How did you guys then apply that to, practically speaking, to the next trip, and how much better was trip 2 than trip 1?
Yeah, so trip 1 was really cool just in the context of, first time and just all new, right? And I mean, shoot, that is a cool area and habitat that I haven't really. So it's Cairns is not. It's slightly less tropical than far north Queensland. So when you're up getting green trees and stuff like that, it's slightly less tropical, but simultaneously, it was all new, all bizarre. Seeing scrub pythons in the wild was fantastic.
Yeah.
The cool part with that was, well, the part that makes it really satisfying in the end, right? Because there is something to the process of herping, be it the physicality of doing the thing, or sort of the trials that go with it. In both instances, so we saw 2 live ones. Each was preceded by one that was killed on the road. And within, the first one, I mean, it was within half a mile of then seeing it, right? But that was a very grim 10 minutes for sure. The idea of going, spending a lifetime of waiting to go to Australia, getting there. So that was down at Tully Gorge, and there's a road so as it's kind of in the lowlands, it is amongst these banana plantations that they guard super intensely, right? Because it's not only a monoculture, it's like all the same, every banana is identical or whatever, so they're very susceptible to disease.
Sure.
So they're very heavily sort of guarded, and you definitely can't be interacting with them and that sort of stuff. But at the top, there's a it's the backside of a hydroelectric dam, I think. And so we're cruising this from, another interesting thing about Australia that I hadn't really conceived of is how early the sun sets there compared to sort of what we're used to and what would be a good prime herping time. So the sun will set at 6 o'clock or 6:30, something like that, depending on where you're at vertically. And so it's just a little bit different, right? The idea of, oh, we're going out to road cruise at night and it's 6:30, we're starting at 5:45, something like that. It would be odd in North America to be doing that, at a time you'd expect to see stuff. So anyway, it was just us on this night for 3 hours. And then there was someone who worked at the dam, and that was literally the only other car we saw until we were completely out of that area. And he must have gone out of the way, just smashed the shit out of this 6-foot scrub python. I mean, it was, like, again, so different trials and tribulations. The good news was it was so destroyed that it's like, well, at least that animal, there was minimal suffering there, because that was just done. As opposed to when we went to Florida, October of 23, we wound up being, I don't know, 40. We got caught in this traffic that kept us from turning off. That this 4-wheeler deliberately took out what would have been my lifer at the time, Eastern Diamondback, and had only just clipped it on the head, and so it was synaptically writhing, this 4-foot beautiful Diamondback. And honestly, that probably cast a pale on the whole trip. So I had to go back and find a Diamondback February of the last year. But honestly, that's the sort of then that trial puts you on tilt for the whole trip of saying, okay, well, I know they're here, and you spend the whole time trying to have saved that moment or whatever, and it definitely kind of dimmed the whole thing. But back to Australia the first time, so we see that, but then we get half a mile, quarter mile down the road, 8 to 10. I don't know how long whether it was 8 to 10 minutes. It felt very long. The mood in the car was very dark. I was not in a great place, and sure enough, found a duplicate, basically. 4, 5, 6 footer. They're deceptive or difficult, as you know, better than I do at this point. People underestimate their size because of their how thin they are relative to their length, especially when they're small. So that people, oh, that was a 3-footer. Now that was at least 5.5, if not 6 feet, right? Because, well, I know it was an inch and a half around. That definitely wasn't, that size.
The 3-footer is a 6-month-old if you feed it right. So
right, exactly. So that was, kind of in that tweener size, which was really cool. And just the sort of reviving the attitude and all those things. And then on the last night that we were up in Cairns, on the way down, similar thing. That road got more traffic, so it wasn't sort of the visceral thing, but there was one either similar size to that or slightly larger that had been hit kind of in between passes in a more expansive space. We'd kind of gone down, and then it was dead on the road, on the way back. But right before we had gotten back to where we were going, then what was probably a young, either large immature or small mature male, probably, I don't know, 11, 12 feet. Again, so kind of maybe 3 inches around at the vent, something like that. 2.5, 3 inches. Definitely a more substantial. Just started coming out onto the road as we're going. I'm driving. We're, had put in the positive herp positivity out there in terms of was talking about how everything is cool. Even the stuff that is now so commonplace in the hobby that really that it's all about our attitude to it. All of it's cool. All those things. Put those positive vibes out, and this one started to crawl out and was maybe a foot into the road, and fortunately I was able to see it, respond accordingly. Missed it, pulled over, and then of course, even though it's, I don't know, 12:30, 1 in the morning in this desolate stretch of road, a car starts coming towards us, so I'm running in the lane on the highway. Like absolutely not.
Classic, not this.
Yeah. Classic Australia. They didn't stop, just changed lanes and went around, and all good. And so that was probably my favorite snake that first trip. Just not a huge one. They obviously get much larger, but nevertheless, the experience of interacting with that, and that was funny because we it's kind of the thing with snakes that large, non-venomous snakes that large, is you kind of need a way to contain them a little bit, and so I'd put it around my neck, and that was all fine and good. It was totally it had taken it didn't love me stop when I initially grabbed it just to pull it off the road. It took a bite on my ankle, but otherwise very placid. But as I have it around my neck, and then Chris was coming to take some pictures, and that sort of motion, either the flash or the motion or whatever, it fully backed up into my chest, so that now its head is, I don't know, 10 inches below my chin. And I was then just sort of picturing, well, what'll this look like in the airport when I'm walking through? And they're just like, what happened to your face, mate? You know, that sort of deal. So fortunately, it didn't give it a go and all that. It came out all right. But yeah, that was really fun.
Yeah, I mean, shoot, I could only imagine that feeling of you've trekked across the world, and not only did you find, I mean, it would be my target species. I'd have to imagine it was one of your top target species there.
Absolutely.
But also, like an 11, 12-foot individual at that. That's the size of the biggest scrubs that we get over here, average speaking.
Yeah.
So, that's not a monster kinghorn eye, but that's a big ass scrub. So I have to imagine.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. It definitely was what, the principal ideation for that spot, combined with that was a spot that was recommended as, going all that way. You want to go to places that have relatively high both diversity and quantity. Yeah. Obviously, there are places that, I mean, again, Pine Barrens, very difficult place to find a snake. Even Northern Territory in some areas, Fog Dam, well known for having a huge density of water pythons. I have not ever found that in terms of those, the density of those. Certainly, I've seen a lot of keelback, and certainly I've seen water pythons there, but not in the huge numbers that sometimes can occur there. But yeah, Cairns was presented as, hey, you should first trip to Australia, go here. You like scrub pythons, you got that. And what I would say for those two is just their capacity to interact with a whole bunch of different conditions. Cyclone Owen was coming through on the back half of our trip, which was funny because Owen McIntyre hadn't come with us, so of course that was, Cyclone Owen was coming on. So at the back half, we had gotten quite a bit of rain, and the only snake that didn't seem troubled by that was scrub pythons. They were just out and about, didn't care. So Scott says, yeah, the densities of fog are pre-towed. So yeah, you can still find them, but the contrast I was going to draw there is that if you're over in Kakadu, which is one of the coolest places in the world, there's so many different biomes within that park. I think a lot of the Owen Pelly struggle, both in terms of access generally, and just sort of the practicality of doing it, is that even if you live in Darwin, that's going to be 3 hours each way. And there's the possibility to see a whole host of different things, but it's unlikely that, there's no guaranteed anything. There are things that are more like children's pythons are pretty producible out there. At times, night tigers can be the Boiga irregularis, the Northern Territory form of Boiga irregularis, that look like womas. Basically, there's actually one on INAT that someone had misidentified as the person who had seen it. Yeah, called it a woma. So yeah, those can be. Although on this last trip, then spent a week up there and didn't see a single one, which was fascinating because on the previous trip we had seen, I don't know, at least into double digits of them, to the point where it became, oh, it's just another one, we'll move it off the road, or whatever, but let's keep going. So super interesting, but I do think that has played a part, that and just limitation on access to escarpment country are really the Owen Pelly things, that it's like, hey, even someone who lives close, and Darwin isn't close to anything, you're out there for Australia, you're closer to Indonesia than you are to Canberra. Even there, it's not easy. Yeah. So, yeah. So that was I guess the first trip was just defined by, we didn't see a ton of things, saw some really cool things, and I just took it as lessons learned. As I said, we got some good advice, but it was kind of the place we were going to go one day. Oh, it's closed for a bicycle race amongst the local community. Okay, well then you need to be able to pivot, and ideally be able to pivot in a practical way, not like, well, we're finding that out at 9 a.m. If we wanted to find this other thing, that's 2 hours away, and we would have wanted to be there at 9 a.m. So that's not great timing. So it just taught me to focus on my planning, ideation around those things, make sure I was trying to account for that, and we put that into play in the NT trip the second time. And as I say, managed to turn up So what? Water python, black-headed python, children's python, water, black-headed, children's, Owen Pelly, and Darwin carpet.
Pretty damn
Yeah,
good.
so 5, everything save an olive python.
Yeah.
So then it turned into what, COVID shut everything down, so we didn't go 2020 or 21 through 22 through 21. So 20 or 21, we went in 22. Basically went up to central eastern Queensland and down, doing a drive on that. Saw a bunch of cool stuff. Saw probably 7 or 8 coastal carpets, including one of the Brisbane, actually after we left Scott and Ty's place.
Nice.
Saw kind of that prototype, what we call in captivity, that Brisbane coastal, beautiful brown ground color. The other ones, I guess they're all southern coastals in the new sort of grouping that Nick and Justin have put together. Saw what were at the time jungles in 2018. Actually, those were cool too. Saw the gelatin jungles. And the really cool thing about that is we saw one of them that's had one of the cool things about the captive line of gelatin jungles that we have is they'll have this dual striping, kind of call it like a railroad track look to them. And one of the two that we had seen was of that phenotype. The other one looked like one of Eric's citrus tigers. It was this beautiful purple thing with a big old tick on its neck. But yeah, so really interesting. You don't know what to make of it. Certainly some of our, I think the look, yeah, we've talked about it, or it's been talked about before, but in captive stuff, right, things can exist within that space, and then just, but if we have a more narrow view of that phenotype within captivity, we'll kind of selectively drive towards that look. And gelatins, it's kind of the greenish coloration to them, particularly in sort of the light color. And then to me, that railroad track type striping is pretty distinctive for that area as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa has a question about seasonality. Have you guys considered different seasons? And she asked if April would be a good time for an Australia trip.
So April, let's see what that would be. So that's fall going into winter. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the area, right? So I do think, sure. Yeah, and so speaking of April, so April's tough post-wet. Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend where you are, right? So in terms of within Australia is so massive, we kind of conceive of it, in the Northern Hemisphere map sort of sense, and it seems smaller than it is relative to sort of the U.S. in the same way that Africa, the size of Africa is understated, based on making a 3-dimensional object 2-dimensional, sure. Maybe a hot take. Anyway, it's going to be very based on where you are. And so like going to the Kimberley, right, you got to go in late May into June just because it's inaccessible in the wet, at least in terms of spots if you're trying to find a roughie and stuff like that. So some different areas have different restrictions. Different times can be good. My experience in terms of trying different times of year is more, I have more of that in the US than I do there for sure. I think I've only ever been really in October to Australia. Yeah.
Okay.
Although if going to the Kimberley, I would go, as I say, late May into June.
Makes sense. Have you guys gotten down to see like diamonds and breadline stuff like that?
So we tried that on breadline. No, I haven't been there at this point. Did have a day looking for diamonds, a day and a half or whatever. Keith and Teresa had left a little bit early, but relative to when Eric and I flew out on this last trip in October. And I spent, I don't know, probably 15 hours looking for one. It felt a little bit cool. We were seeing other activity and stuff, but couldn't kick one up. Did see an eastern brown snake, and that cool weather, again, diamond should theoretically be active. I think we just didn't happen to, come across one or spot one if there was one that was sitting there. But, I would have expected the same thing that we saw with this brown snake, where it was certainly I could get the best pictures of that of any of the brown snakes that I've ever seen because it was cooled down, right? So they're warm enough for them to be active, particularly in the sun. It was probably, I mean, it had been cold that overnight. It was probably, I think it had gotten into the low 50s, high 40s, something like that. And then it had warmed up, but only into the low 60s. And then, so in direct sun, you know, you, again, kind of like that Northern California from March of this year where it feels right. You know, you're in the right spot. Every step you take, you're hoping to see one. But realistically, it's like, man, we're probably a couple weeks early. So.
Got it. Okay. Well, yeah. So Scott says if you saw the browns, then the diamonds were out. You just.
Yeah, just didn't come across one. Yeah. No, totally. So, you know, the chance was there. And again, that was the only time I've been to Sydney or spent any. We did make a quick run before our flight up to Darwin on the way out to one of those similar spots, but just had really like an hour, you know, 90 minutes, something like that. Did a short-term rental car to get it just because we didn't want to wait at the airport. It maximized the opportunity. But yeah, I mean, it was good. I'll definitely have to go back because I definitely would love to see one. They're beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. So in all of your trips, you know, I know that the snakes are kind of the focus, but Varanus and then Taliqua, what have you guys seen of those genuses?
Yeah, so Varanus I love Varanids for sure. And on this trip actually wound up being mostly in terms of stuff that we saw. I did see a really beautiful blackhead, did see a children's python, did see a water python, but did see the NT form of the Weigel's brown snake. But I would categorize it as a lizard trip in terms of what we, you know, really saw. Some of the coolest stuff was Oedura geckos. But yeah, saw in terms of Varanids on this trip, saw Scalaris, a whole bunch of Scalaris in Darwin, and then saw Mitchellii. Wound up seeing 3 Mitchellii in Darwin, which was really cool. Those were, again, to Scott's point, relative to Fog Dam. I understand, you know, if you look at sort of historical field guides, what the range on those was, it's dramatically reduced since the 80s or whenever cane toads, you know, it gotten up that way. And I think they're probably because that's, you know, small amphibians or things that were very much on the menu. So it was really problematic for that species in particular. So that was really cool. And it's something that presumably has been in the US, but never produced here. As far as I know, there is the guy in the UK who's bred them, the Mitchell's water monitors. Seen Mertens. This trip was cool to see Mertens not at there is this population in suburban Darwin that are semi-domesticated, which is really cool. So they're, they're habituated. They're at this, which would be a better term for it. There's like a children's park that there's literally playground equipment and all this stuff. And the females will lay along the bank of this creek. And Owen almost had a big male. He came right over to him and almost walked up him when we went in 2019.
Wow.
But on this trip saw 3 or 4 in Kakadu, you know, totally wild Mertens that were, you know, very responsive. So that was really cool to see those. Mitchellii was cool because it was interesting. Essentially, in the same spot you can see the spotted tree monitors, the Scalaris, and they're, I mean, no wild monitor for the most, save the habituated ones are, in general, they're reticent to let you get close to them. Sure. Or even taking pictures or whatever. They're pretty wary. And the Scalaris, though, are a little bit more resilient. They'll pose out at least for a little bit and stuff like that. The Mitchellii, in general, are really reclusive, even compared to those Scalaris in the same habitat. So our first day looking for them, there was a perfect Varanid-looking snapped tree with opening, you know, this sort of thing. And I had seen it just had its head poking out. And at this point I'd seen 4 or 5 Scalaris, knew, you know, what Mitchellii looked like. And I couldn't even respond fast enough to get a photo of this animal. And then it was just flat gone into this hollow tree.
Yeah.
And but everyone's sort of like, is half giving me the business about, did you actually, we're looking for Mitchell. Yeah, obviously we were thrilled to see Scalaris, but having seen 4 of them and really we're trying to see Mitchellii, it was kind of like, oh, did you really see one? So the next day when we had gone out, I was able to get a photo. I was ready with the camera from long distance and was able to get photos before it again retreated or whatever. But definitively, that's what that was. So that wound up actually being the first Mitchellii that I've seen. Although we saw it third, then on that second day we saw 2 others that were out basking and definitively seen. So yeah, theoretically the third one I had seen, but it was the same one I had seen the day before and validated having seen it and all that. So it was really good.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you guys have plans to make it back out to WA in the near future?
Yeah, so Justin had continued his trip. So this trip was Keith and Teresa McPeak, Eric Burke, myself, and Justin Julander.
Okay.
Justin doesn't care for flying and doesn't love, putting in, I think I was something like 40 hours door to door on the way out to, just based on flight times and whatever. So I'd left my house 40 hours before I turned up where we were staying. And that can kind of be its own thing. So he doesn't like doing that to only be there, in this case, we were there 8 nights just because you're gone 10 days, but you're only there 8 nights or whatever. And so he stayed an extra week, drove down to Kununurra and saw Gloweredeye in WA, which I'm very jealous of. Saw Acanthurus there as well. That looked a lot like Kingorum, but it was not. But yeah, I mean, certainly. So the Kimberley's very appealing. Seeing an imbricata in the wild would be really high on Eric's list. So, and there's a ton of cool stuff out that way. See a Woma, go to Shark Bay, try and see a Woma.
Yeah.
All that stuff would be all cool stuff, man. Australian pythons is its own list. Australian varanids. I've seen lace monitors, which are really cool. Saw a bunch on this past trip. There was one that had darted, potentially not a lace monitor, right? I believe in that area, Rosenbergi, the Heath monitors are also in habitat. There was a small goanna on a small size of a large goanna on the road that was super responsive and it darted off. That kind of felt like maybe that's what that was, but certainly not something you would count or whatever. But
Sure.
And then Eric and I actually so we dropped Keith and Teresa off, and then we had a little bit of time, and we hiked about 6 or 7 miles at this spot. Then realizing like we were about halfway, and it was like, oh, this isn't a loop trail. We're gonna have to either make this we got to get across this river. So you don't want to turn up late for an international flight for sure.
Yeah.
Let alone that one. But in that little excursion, wound up sort of inadvertently stumbling across 2 large lacies and a smaller one. But one of them, it was a big one, and I surprised it, and it surprised me. And I was about 4 foot from it, and yeah, that was really cool.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so very, very cool. Yeah, and a ton of Australian water dragons on previous trips. I had seen one from a long distance when we went in 2018. In 2019, we saw one, but those were pretty shy. The spot we went to this time, they were pretty habituated, and probably saw 20, 25 of them on this trip. That area, they're more concentrated for sure than they are either in eastern central Queensland, kind of in the far bush where we were in 2019 or in 22, and the one in 18 had just bolted on the road. It was more like that. So it was cool to see it. That was my lifer to see one, but it was probably, it was very wary and bolted when I stopped the car, jump out of the car, still 50 feet away, and it just bolted. So.
Yeah, that's cool. So back on the lace monitor topic, how different or similar do wild lace monitors look compared to like what we have in the US, these, line bred, so to speak, selectively bred lace monitors?
Yeah. So, I think I haven't seen a Bell's phase, but in terms of the normative phase, I think they look pretty similar. Those Bells,
Okay.
Scott was telling me the sort of the potential captive origins for that stuff that we have. I think those are very genetically tight in our captive collection. So those all look really similar. There's some specific things that are really similar about those animals. But yeah, the wild phenotype, you know, they look, they look pretty similar.
Okay.
And we'd actually seen the first one. I'd seen one dead in the Cairns area in 2018, and then in 22 was the Lifer Wild one. That one was up north of Brisbane, and then all these were in Sydney. So.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. I saw the pictures that you guys are posting and stuff, and that you were spending some time with Gavin.
Yeah, that was awesome.
What was that like, and seeing the Owen Pelly project and everything? How was that?
Yeah, that was fantastic. So I mean, they're just, and I'm sure for anyone who's really into Australian pythons, right, especially in the U.S., where, well, and even Australia, if you would have said, 20 years ago or whatever, that was a dream species. Like literally that. Talk about, I guess, planting stuff or not planting stuff or whatever. Even if you go back literally 20 years ago, I know I was looking closely at maps of Kakadu and surrounds, trying to really understand that habitat and understand where they would be, and sort of the putting to my own mind like where maybe the Peter Krause animals were from and that sort of stuff. So yeah, that was a dream animal. So to wind up, when we went in 2019, we had met up with Gavin, and actually he was the one who had spotted the Darwin carpet in the Botanic Gardens or close by. And so he showed us one. So we got to hold what was probably a 5-footer then. But yeah, being in a spot with, essentially, I think that's all he has. And, he's got more than a couple. So, the ability to be holding hatchlings, or, they're really large babies, even compared to scrubs.
Really?
Yeah, they're really, really long and thin. When we had found one in 2019, that was a point in time where I was still, I still look at iNaturalist, but I don't post stuff there anymore. Actually, it's interesting you brought up the Varanids, because it was really Varanids that made me stop posting to iNaturalist. We had seen on the way in Kakadu, had seen a Gould's monitor, and there was a fellow, a German keyboard warrior who was arguing with me about what I had seen in the wild. And I was like, this is not good for my emotional well-being. I don't need to be arguing either about what I saw or Varanid taxonomy with, somebody in Europe about this. And, it seemed to me at least that, maybe he had multiple accounts, or at least, his buddy, would come in and chime in, and it just turned into a whole mess. And that really turned me off to posting stuff, but I do still look. Anyway, I had posted the Owen Pelly, when we had found it out of that same trip. So that trip was kind of the last time I was posting stuff. And yeah, Scott's funny. Dave Barker's comment was, Owen Pellies, yeah, they're essentially look like overgrown Haitian vine boas. And I think there is something to that it really is, basically sort of their form and physiology. But so yeah, being at Gavin's place and the ability to hold ones that were, 2.5, 3 feet long, hold ones that were probably 7 foot long, and then, hold that really big one. Just awesome. And the idea that, if you'd have told me 20 years hence, you'll be holding, or you'll open a wooden nest box to see a Owen Pelly maternally incubating a clutch, I just said, yeah, okay, I'll keep that on the docket. That's something to look forward to, So yeah, that was really cool. I may have mentioned it previously, right, in terms of putting the second scrub python around my neck on that first trip. That was sort of the technique with that big Owen Pelly. It's just so much snake, and I think Keith had it out first, or maybe Eric had it out first, and he was, that's a lot of arboreal snake to kind of manage and deal with or whatever. And certainly the appropriate tactic was to kind of, wrap it up around you and whatever, especially with something that I wasn't concerned was going to give me a go. And it was like, okay, you've kind of anchored it and it's more comfortable, and it definitely made it a lot easier to manage.
How long would you say that snake was?
I think it was something like 15 feet, 16 feet.
That's so crazy.
Yeah, just truly wild. And in that same vein, so it was fun to be able to show Justin where we had seen the one in 2019 to give a sense of perspective. And he came to admit that despite everyone after that trip we got a lot of feedback. Oh, I'd have gone up the tree, and actually seeing it then in context, Justin admitted, that at a minimum wouldn't have been a good idea. He would have been sorely tempted, but it wouldn't have been a good idea. It also gives some sense of perspective. In the photo, it looks really big and is not close. We're not close to it. We're solidly 25 feet from it. And so I think that one was probably pretty close to being about the same size as that really big one we handled at Gavin's.
Wow. I mean, I can only imagine what coming across a snake that large in the wild feels like. There's got to be at least a little bit of an intimidation factor of like, this is a big ass animal that could, it could probably fuck me up if it really wanted to. Like, this is a giant snake. This is, no matter who you are, that's still a giant snake. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And it seems like a lot of on this past trip, the bummer of it was we didn't wind up catching a break to see an olive python. The thing that jumps to mind with that is a lot of the ones that people see are pretty large. And I think that would certainly fall into that box. After the Weigel's brown snake, we actually got rained out at that spot. It was something you'll be used to from down your way. Certainly in Colorado, Utah, we get sort of these apocalyptic storm. We don't get normal rain. When it rains, it's end of day stuff, but it's typically short duration.
Yeah.
We wound up catching this cell that I still don't really understand how it had happened, but we see the Weigel's brown snake, get a few photos of that, and then started heading down the road, and all of a sudden we're in this, and it's like, well, just keep going. It's the same thing. I'm sure it'll be like the rain that we have, and drive 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Well, this isn't getting any better. And in fact, maybe it's getting worse. So we turned, and presumably, that's not great for herping that area. So it was okay, let's turn around. And it was bringing trees down and branches down and stuff like that. So it was like, okay, let's turn around and keep going. Somehow we wound up being stuck in it for the next 45 minutes to an hour. And it was like, what happened? We drove into this 10 minutes and somehow it went an hour. Anyway, once only maybe an hour north of that spot, there was a dead 6-foot olive python on the road. It had just come out, just gotten clipped on the head. So, but it felt super warm. It had obviously been sitting on that road for a long time. It wasn't like we just missed it, but that was a bummer. It would have been nice to tick off the last top end python. Yeah,
I could only imagine how awesome it would be to see an olive. Do you guys have plans on trying to get the WA olives ever?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a really cool. Really cool. I don't know how different they actually are, right? I've never seen one. I've seen photos of them, but never seen one in person. Even, I don't think that's something. I'm sure they're floating around in Australia, but I think even there they're pretty uncommon. And maybe that's partially a function of not being all that different, coming from a really restricted habitat. Being WA generally, right? Even in Australian collections, it's sort of its own bird within Australia.
Yeah.
As we saw with COVID, right? WA locked out the rest of Australia for a long time. So for a long time, I believe in WA, all you could keep were WA animals. There was nothing coming in, even from the captive side. And then within most of Australian herpetoculture, which isn't WA, those animals were WA animals were rare. So and there was even a period of time where you could get in Western Australia, they could collect wild animals. There was somebody, the coolest website in 2005 was going and seeing like wild blackhead, wild WA blackheads that were available for sale to keepers in WA.
That's awesome.
Totally wild. But I don't even think those could be sold outside WA. So super interesting.
Oh, that's weird. Huh.
Yeah. So even within Australia, so I think that's why the Pilbara olive is not. I don't even know if they're in captivity in Australia, or certainly private captivity. I don't know. But yeah, that would be awesome to see.
Do you think it's substantiated that they get, whatever, 15, 16 feet or whatever some of the claims are, that they're significantly larger than the eastern form?
Yeah, I mean, so the regular ones get pretty big. So I would imagine that if that habitat, I think, right, so drivers of size, as you see with scrubs, right, it's all, and even dimorphism, sexual dimorphism within different species or whatever within an area. I see it mostly with the captive Solomon Island tree boas, is that where the males, I think in the wild, are never large enough to eat anything bigger than the sort of native skinks. And females get big enough that certainly they take rodents. And that's why when wild ones come in, generally speaking, people have more success with females because they're habituated to, they're of size and, kind of readily will do that. Whereas males will often, kind of seasonally, they'll have a seasonal fast. And then sometimes coming out of that seasonal fast, they'll want lizards or lizard scent or whatever. The point of that was kind of being, okay, if you're over in Carragini, in that area looking for a Pillsbury olive, that maybe that population, if what they have to eat, essentially there's enough to feed babies. They come out as big babies, but there's maybe it's rough for them to be in that intermediate size, and it'll push them to get that extra size, right? If they're eating wallabies or whatever, that there's actually a disincentive to kind of be in the middle. Whereas if there's more prey diversity across a range of sizes, you'll see more of a gradation in size, and maybe you don't get the real huge size, right? We could dwarf reticulated pythons and that whole idea, right? They do actually exist as a, I've had champeyas that, champea is something that famously now people think, oh, it's not even real. It does, those get huge. I had, 6-footers that looked like 6-foot scrub pythons, same 1.5 inch thick, whatever, that were wild males that were probably 10, 15 years old. Because that was sort of that's the prey availability within that space. And I never took it out of, I never tried to stretch it out, which I do think is what makes them grow, right? And again, you would know more than I would, but really, to me, snakes grow from eating large items rather than eating multiple items. So if you kind of are looking for a consistent size or whatever, if you can feed adult Homoheras mice, for years and years and years and years and years, no doubt. Yeah. If you want them to actually grow larger, then you're going to want to boost the size of the item, because I think it stretches them, and that's promoting that shedding and sort of changes that. Then you got to stick with it.
I think, at least from my experience, the main difference with that between scrubs and retics is that I found with scrubs that stunting them, to use a term that isn't that's kind of general, can have some pretty serious health consequences. Where with retics, they seem to be able to live with it.
Yeah, they're more plastic, more
able to. I have scrubs that I can pretty confidently say are stunted, that are short-lived, develop cancer at 3 or 4 years old, or and then you see some people with certain scrub types that they're very committed that these are smaller species or whatever, and you see the pictures year after year, but you never see those things on eggs.
Right.
You'll see a 5-foot female retic on eggs, and that snake might get to 9 feet when it's 15 years old, but it's been laying that whole time. And I can't say I know why that is, but I think that's definitely a dynamic with scrubs that doesn't exist in retics, that kind of separates them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a big part, as ever, right? It's all relative. So what I say, what you or I say is small might not, we might not mean the same thing as one another, and it might not mean the same thing to someone else, right? So if I'm saying it's a small adult Homohera that's still 7 foot long or whatever, it's just not massive, you know what I mean? As opposed to like Nauta is interesting, and I don't know quite what to make of that. Part of it too, right, is just, including notably yourself, all the, people are having much more reproductive success with them now than they ever have. I
think diversity, there were 16 or 17 scrub clutches in the US.
Yeah. I mean, part of that too, I think, right, is, that once it happens, there's more faith that it can happen. That was sort of the deal with Holmes to me, is that it's like for so long there was it had become this idée fixe, that there was this idea, right, this fixed idea that it isn't a thing that can happen. It just won't happen for anyone. And then humorously, so that Oklahoma City Zoo, and maybe this gets to Brandon's thing, we're transitioning a little bit. The Oklahoma City Zoo hatched him in 2018 or 2019.
I think it was 18.
When we were in Australia. So I saw,
Okay.
Blake's pictures or the zoo's pictures or whatever they were. And the fascination, they were born, not born red.
Right.
And I was like, well, I've been saying that since 2005 because I had I had gotten 2 from Cameron that were the size of baby carpet pythons,
Yeah.
and they weren't red. And all the feedback was like, oh, they're older than you think. Or I was like, they're the size of a newborn carpet. They're 25 grams or
It
something.
hasn't had its first set yet. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it shed. Weirdly, it shed immediately. When I had it, they both did and whatever. And it was like, yeah, this isn't I get that it's different, right? And so there was reticence to believe it, or whatever. But it was like, no,
Sure.
I mean, just look at the thing. It fits under a 4-inch terracotta. You break the hole in the terracotta saucer, right? That was its hide box. When I first picked him up, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, when do you think it was red? At that size. So that wasn't a shock or a surprise to me. And then the interesting thing about that, because at the time I thought those were wild caught, but in Daniel Natusch's paper from when he was out at the Bushmaster farm, he mentions them having a clutch of Tracei that had hatched out. That he's like measuring the eggs and all this stuff. And my sort of later supposition has been that maybe those animals that I got were the ones that were reflected in Natusch's paper about that.
Very well.
Yeah, it was just super interesting that, I guess, so maybe Vladimir was actually the first person to breed Tracei in situ, but nevertheless.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess since it's on the mind and it's a little bit of a diversion, let's see if this is the picture before I get into that.
Yep.
Is that yeah. So I guess, yeah, we'll finish Helma Harris before I talk about this next thing, because I'm very curious to get your take on it. But to make Brandon's wish come true, let's see where this picture is. I think this is what he's been asking. Yeah. So tell us about this snake, man.
Yeah, so that was funny. So that was either fall of 2007, spring of 2008. Cameron had so the funny thing, everything is either cyclical or history rhymes or whatever. What would happen with Tracei generally is that as of 2004, so kind of in that 2004, 2005, 2006 window, they would come in with some regularity, and I think that pertained to sort of the Fish and Wildlife recognition or lack thereof of the different species forms, rather than calling them all amethystina or whatever. I think that change in the CITES quotas associated with recognition of those species forms definitely limited the quantity that came in. But during that kind of 04, 06, 04 to 07, let's call it, Cameron would regularly get them, and then they were not that popular. So invariably they would sit on the list for a long time. And I think the price when they would first come in and you'd have 8 or 10 or whatever, they'd be 250, somewhere 250 to 350, and it wasn't always the same price, but that was the general idea. And they would just languish on the list, so that, they would be there. And that's not really, or was not, he's retired now, but was not Cameron's business model, particularly at that time, is to have sort of just stuff sitting there. And so invariably after they'd been there 6 weeks, 8 weeks, he'd put them on special, and it'd be like $150 a piece if you take at least 4 of them, something like that.
Yeah.
And invariably when that would happen, then I would go take all the rest that were there. So I have had, I don't know, 30 of them, something like that.
Wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, over time. I mean, so the only difficulty of kind of being in that business, right, is that shipments come every other week, and to be able to be in local, to be able to go help unbox that stuff and whatever, there's an expectation that you're not going up there to not buy stuff, right? And
Right.
so you wind up selling some stuff that, yeah, just to kind of keep the flow going. You don't necessarily always get to keep all the things that you would like. That Chimera annulated tree boa that Quetzal had produced down in Costa Rica,
Mhm.
you know, had come up. That was ultimately that wound up with Jeff Murray and didn't produce anything. And I don't think it would have anyway, but it was an incredibly visually stunning animal. Kind of, it was a, you know, it was noticeable because it was a mixture of both an orange neonate and the dark phase neonate.
Wow.
That's in that same. You could see that too if you go into the boas or whatever. But
Okay.
anyway, the point would be that I didn't keep 25 or 30 for that entire length of time, especially some of that stuff. Once you could get it in a state where it felt pretty good for sort of interested keepers and things, they'd be interested in that. And so, yeah, I had them for variable lengths of time. This one, I sent to a buddy of mine for probably 6 or 7 years, and then had it back for another 5 or 6 years.
Okay.
And then, unfortunately, one of 2 animals that I ever shipped that died in shipping.
Jeez.
Yeah,
That's,
so that was a bummer. On the way out, I was trying to send it to somebody probably in 2011 or 12, 13. I don't know, something like that. Well, it must no. Yeah, I don't know. My dates and times are confused. But so
yeah.
yeah, actually, this wasn't one that I had. I didn't have this one. My buddy had it for 5 or 6 years, and then I had it maybe a couple of years on the back end of that, and then it died in shipping. I had gotten some more back that then I had for another 5 or 6 years, but not this striped one.
Oh,
But you had an interesting comment on this, and well, I guess a couple interesting points, right? Is that well, yeah. Let me finish the narrative on that. Anyway, this animal came in into either the fall of 07 or the spring of 08. Cameron called me and said, "Hey, dude, I know you like these snakes. Do you want this snake?" But you know that was a time of no list, no pictures or whatever, and I think it was $750, something like that. And I was like hemming and hawing, and you know whatever. And so he posted on King Snake, and I was like, okay, yeah, I'll buy that. That's pretty cool.
yeah.
And so yeah, so I had that one. I sent it out to Tennessee, and then got it back, and then a handful. Yeah, as I say, ultimately wound up dying in shipping on a later. So when I was sending it out later, after having had it back, one of those babies that you had posted earlier was one that I also sent that guy, and then wound up having that animal for 4 or 5 years here as an adult. It was really cool.
Okay.
So,
That's awesome.
yeah, so really cool. But anyway, Cameron got another one, and Chad bought it, right? And that's the one you
Yeah.
have now.
Yep. Yeah, and Brandon, if you're still around, he you know, had picked some little pictures off of INAD of very similar looking animals, and I guess the question would be: are these striped halmaheras a unique population, or are they like I think they were like southern, maybe like southwestern, maybe, Brandon, if I have that right. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, I don't know. That was super interesting. You know, when we were talking about it, so I guess I think you must have posted the one that you have, right? And so I was like, oh yeah, that's reminiscent of
See
this one that I had before. So that was interesting. And then you showed me the INAT link, and yeah, definitely super interesting. I don't know. I feel I'm certainly unqualified to answer that question, but it's sort of, you know, and I could see it either way. And even then, right, we see some things like the Bell's phase lace monitors that I mentioned. Captive breeding seems to suggest that it's a single gene, so it might be a regionally supported or promoted phenotype, but it's still, you know, essentially a genetic mutation that's being propagated there. One super interesting thing, as part of the bringing it back to field herping very briefly, would be I was reading the Right and Right Handbook of Snakes, looking at sort of old records about black pine snakes, you know, with which combine. I mean, heck, it's hard enough to find a pine snake at all, let alone to try and find a Louisiana pine or a black pine at this point or whatever. But I was just trying to do some intel on that, and the interesting thing was back in the 30s that black pine snakes that were found found alongside normal patterned ones. So, and I've had one black pine. This would be 2003, 2004, something like that. And people didn't like it because the chin isn't. There's a white patch on the chin or whatever. So I'd be curious whether, just based on those records from the 30s were super interesting about their whole validity. Is the loading eye, is it really a thing or whatever? Is it just this regional form? And there might have been this selection for what might be just sort of a melanistic gene within that population. And, maybe it's the same as what melanistic theri or whatever. But otherwise, they're just pine snakes. But I
haven't heard that before. That is super interesting.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I hadn't, so Right and Right, which is a cool book because and it's been updated several times. I forget what edition I have, but it's from the one I have is from the late 50s, I think. It was interesting to read. Oh, well, we find them alongside normal looking pine snakes and all this stuff, and maybe just sort of habitat pressures and sort of what we talked about in terms of in captivity selecting for a phenotype, maybe the pressures that have been applied and just how reduced their habitat is and the overall quantity and all those pressures have made it so, we think black pine snakes, they're all black and all, it's this distinctive look and whatever. And I mean, there are records from Alabama in the, early days, so to speak, of saying, yeah, we found stuff that, looked like what they would just call a Melanoleucus.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine that, and I'm not suggesting anyone do this. No one in captivity has probably ever bred a black pine snake to a Louisiana pine snake. I'd have to imagine right?
Right. You wouldn't think so, or a Florida pine or whatever. It'd just be interesting what, not, again, I wouldn't suggest it and whatever, but it is just interesting where it's like I guess that's the danger, right? In presuming we know more than we do. So it's possible that it's actually just a melanistic pine snake. And if you had a that's all the genes that we're seeing at this point. So.
Wow. We don't have enough time tonight to go down that rabbit hole. That's you're blowing my mind right now. I never even considered that. I always just thought it was this own unique isolated population. I did not know that they were concurrent like that. That's fascinating.
Or at least it once were,
It's true.
Yeah, you could find normal looking or not what we would call, if you saw it. I mean, that's the thing, right? And it's super interesting just with perspective and knowledge and all these different things of like, okay, if you presented that today, and heck, I mean, maybe it wouldn't be like a Burlington County, Jersey pine bearing, pine or something. But if you went to Alabama and you found what you would call like, a northern pine snake, maybe someone would see in South Carolina or whatever, you would get destroyed for sure. You would get destroyed. And yet, we have, written references to people having seen effectively that.
Yeah.
80, 90 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's why I never understand when people take hard line stances on things that they truly cannot have the full picture on. Like, I don't know. I can't bring myself to understand that mindset. Like, because I mean, right now I could have easily been like, what the hell are you talking about? Black pines and northern pines, that can't be the same thing. Like, but so Sue, I don't know. I've never been there. I haven't found these snakes. If somebody has, that they know better than me, obviously, because they've been there and done it. So,
wild, right? So
crazy. Well, we might have to do a second episode talking more about Pituophis, because I could talk about Pituophis forever. But I want to show this picture, this Halmahera. This to me almost seems kind of like these stripy ones that we're talking about, even though it's much more heavily patterned, clearly, for anyone who's watching the video, not listening to the audio. But I mean, very distinctive markings that are not the typical banded Tracei appearance, but not quite as reduced as our striped animals. But
certainly the strong lateral splitting.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, over time, how many individuals did you come across, or did you see at CAMs that kind of had a relatively similar phenotype to this?
Yeah, so it's interesting there was more, I don't know what it looks like now, and certainly I don't, have the opportunity to see them all in the same place and that sort of thing. But I know early Python radio days, right? The Jim Karosky used to run the MP forum. I think I'm getting, I think that name is aligning right.
Better than me.
Had come on and was, there was conversation about, are there actually a couple different forms of Tracei? And certainly I've acknowledged and have seen that, right? There are some that are super contrasty and dark. There are some you could go in the pattern basis. I think his suggestion was even there was sort of some maybe head differentiation. Again, if we're talking about wild collected adult animals, obviously there's plenty of opportunity both in the wild and then associated with the collection process for there to be damage and injury. Even that one, right? I don't know if there's sort of, that was an animal that probably through the process had taken a little bit of a head. It's almost like that eye is a little, pulled back slightly bit, on that near side top. So, it's like, there's a little bit of scarring there or something, from previous trauma. So that was, that there was a male, that's a long-term captive male.
Makes sense. So that's interesting that you say that about head structure differences, because obviously my sample size is 1, but that male is physiologically completely different than the rest of my Halmahera group. Not only appearance wise, but the head is like vertically compressed, much more triangular. I mean, it's a male scrub python head. So, but I have some other male, my other bigger male Tracei is actually behind me right now, much more bulbousy head, kind of almost closer to like the class Dilepis end of the spectrum, to kind of put a word to it. I need to go to Halmahera now.
Right? Yeah, that would be epic for sure. Talk about seeing scrub pythons is one thing. Seeing those, so to me, those were always a snake that, held a ton of appeal to me. It was, in the same vein as going to Gavin's place. It was really cool. Chuck on our first trip to SoCal had gone out herping with us on the back end of the trip, and then I stayed at his house. So he didn't have nearly as many Halmahera as Gavin had Owen Pellies, but nevertheless, seeing all those in their grow outs and all that was really, really cool. It was really funny, he's got him, whatever that deep 90 tub or whatever it is. One of them, it just starts to, I'm just checking it out, and it starts to open its mouth like it's going to give a little feedback. It was just super cute and, funny to be standing there like, okay, this, again, in that same vein of even, 5 or 10 years, before that, like, would have been unbelievable. The notion you're in this, side room that's all grow out, captive bred Tracei.
Yeah. It's, I mean, the work that, people like him and Shane have done with these snakes is really just absolutely next level. I could only imagine what that was like to have, just to see those little captive bred babies. I've had small Halmaheras, not quite neonate, but they were probably 6 months old to 8 months old when I got them, and it's just that's a special experience. That you really can't put words to what it's like to understand what these animals are, know the history behind it, and then have that tiny little one, in your hand like that. It's so cool.
Well, and it's so promising, right? Relative to, again, so scrubs are, people are having so much more success in the idea of, as you say, what's happened with Shane. And I'm not sure what's going on with Chuck's at this point, but those animals are out there. It should be that much easier, and that's the beautiful thing with those small ones too, right? It's just the potential, the promise, right? What you're talking about when you got they're maybe 18 inches long, something like that, and you're just going like, this thing is, it feels very viable, as opposed to, a lot of that lack of success, particularly in the early days. I don't think Halmahera was set up very well in terms of infrastructure to export stuff. So that, they were talking about really rough trips, big adult snakes making really rough trips. Obviously that's not,
never gonna be
those
good.
things don't promote success, right?
Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah, one of the female that's behind me, you probably couldn't see her if I had moved out of the way, but yeah, she was one that I got, yeah, 18 inches or so, and she's like 8.5 foot now. Had her for probably a little over 6 years now, almost 6 years. Wow, and that's I don't know. There's something very gratifying about taking a snake that's so seldom worked with, getting a baby some way, shape, or form, and taking it up to adulthood. That's just, I don't know. People need to experience that. It's very different than, and it's not better or worse. It's just a very different experience than some of the captive bred animals or some of the more common stuff that we have. It's something that few people have even been able to try to do. It's an entirely different thing. But kind of on the Halmahera topic, these aren't, I'm not referencing Halmaheras, but a snake with a similar phenomenon, and that would be the Biak scrubs. To our knowledge, or at least of ones we've seen, the only other scrub that starts off with adult coloration. What are your thoughts on Biak scrubs? Have you seen them come through over time with your work with stuff with Cam and whatnot?
No, and that was always a surprise to me.
Interesting.
Considering the green trees and sort of the sustainable harvest and all that, all those things that they were, and I have to assume then that probably represented disinterest in terms of like some of those things kind of become similarly fixed ideas in terms of sort of what's the market for this? Obviously they did come in occasionally, the barkers, right? That was sort of the original animals, and I'm positive that was a sort of special order request relative to getting those. And then there probably wasn't a ton of, again, so that would put that at the mid 90s. Beyond sort of the curio effect of it, at that point in time, it didn't seem like, I guess there wasn't uptake on it. So Cameron probably brought in, the shipment that they got, and then maybe they were at a point where they felt good enough about what they had. And then this is presuming that they do turn up there, that it's not some incredibly difficult thing to find, which would really surprise me. So I don't think I'm wrong on this. I think the answer would be, if then, a shipment or two came in, obviously Cameron's not in the business of bringing stuff in that's difficult to sell, right? The idea is to bring in stuff that aligns with market demand and those sorts of things. And, so I have to presume that there wasn't really a huge uptake on those for a shipment or two or over a couple of years or whatever. And then there's just like, well, there doesn't seem to be the interest to substantiate it. And then by the time maybe that comes back around, right, the sort of, the interest in scrubs in the early 2000s was more than the mid 90s, and now it's, so much broader than it was even in the early 2000s. But at that point, maybe the infrastructure is sort of set, and it's like the collectors aren't looking for those animals. They don't catch those animals, and those things definitely happen. Like with Irian Jaya carpets, certainly and I think most stuff in general, it was like essentially getting, he had made clear, and probably all the other sort of folks that are taking on this trade, there's a incentive to get smaller animals rather than larger animals, unless they're really large, right? The exceptional anaconda, or the purported, hey, we'll pay X, the Bronx Zoo will pay X amount for a legit 20-foot anaconda or whatever. That other than outliers, that generally speaking, people want to get smaller animals in terms of wild caught stuff. So in that same way, it could just become, okay, we didn't, that was sort of out of the infrastructure to collect those. So yeah, surprisingly, I don't think I ever saw any Biak scrubs at Bushmaster.
Wow.
So that's super interesting. I've seen the one or ones that David Means had when he brought them to Carpet Fest, and they were out in, had them out in Eric's backyard and stuff. Definitely neat. Definitely neat snakes. I didn't even know that they weren't born red. So that's really interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, there's only been one clutch of them ever, and they were born full adult coloration. I have had a neonate in the past, an imported neonate, and it was also full adult coloration. So yeah, they're super weird. Yeah. They're really weird to scrub, without question. Absolutely weird to scrub. They are their own thing. I don't know. I was curious.
Which makes sense, right? With because what Biak, however you whatever the actual local pronunciation is, I think it's not. the ocean around it is very deep, right? So it's continental rather than, it's not an Australia to Papua New Guinea situation where, in the Pleistocene, you could walk there or whatever. That I believe that it's, I guess, I don't know if oceanic is right or whatever it is, but so the framing that those things are more distinct, right? There's less sort of cross-pollination between Biak and the top of New Guinea than there is between, like, say, southern New Guinea and the top of Australia.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know either. I'm learning a whole. Okay, cool. Well, on the topic of babies that aren't quite typical for scrub pythons, I couldn't go through your albums and see these guys, man. That animal, for one, that's an incredible looking snake, but yeah, that's something that I'd love to see that in front of me one day.
Right?
Yeah, that's the ultimate goal, man. God, those snakes are incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah, and those, honestly, the funny thing, some of this stuff, the Tracei came in relatively frequently. Clastolepis never really did, at least from the early 2000s. When I was growing up, they were not a common animal to see up there.
Huh.
No. And I don't know, again, if that kind of reflected infrastructure in terms of how many were being sent to the farm from the wild, how many were going, how many they were working with at the farm. It might have just been practicalities of those things.
Sure.
I don't know, but yeah, those, to me, those were never something that was super common. That seemed like more of a 90s thing in terms of when they were really readily available. The funny thing to me, or that I always think of, is, so in the reproductive husbandry book, right, there's a Clastolepis in there that's in there as amethystina, which is what it was, obviously at the time, but that's a really pretty one too,
Yeah. So, and I show these. This is another baby picture.
Yep.
Did you see enough babies to be able to tell what they do look like when they are fresh neonates?
I thought that look on that super orange, the one before, to me, it would be, something in that vein. That one obviously is not freshly born, but it's pretty close. It's probably a couple months old. Sure. And I would think that that's, pretty close to what they would look like.
Okay.
That one's a little bit larger and a little bit dark, has darkened up a little bit. Yeah.
And the only reason I say that is I had one that I picked off a table at a reptile show that was labeled a sarong in the mix of a shipment of like Tanamera-y Southerns. And it hadn't had its first shed yet. It still had that green on it. I was able to key it out as a clasto based on, a little bit of head structure and then just the way that the pattern shifted throughout the body.
Sure.
But it was like gray. But it was not
awesome. Yeah.
So
I do remember having seen, that's interesting, right? So I do remember having seen one there that I thought was axanthic based on, that was the look, and it's entirely possible that then it wasn't. It was, sort of what you're describing. So I do remember having seen one that looked like that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious. We haven't, as a, captive hobby, we haven't seen enough baby Moluccan scrub pythons to really say definitively, but I'm just curious if it is if the baby coloration isn't quite as definite as it is with like amethystina. So
yeah, I think it's certainly possible.
It's interesting. Yeah, man, there's so many more questions than answers, the proverbial played out saying. But I don't know, it makes it fun. Like if there really are two or more distinctive types of Halmahera scrub, or obviously there's islands that we get tree monitors from and reticulated pythons from and blue tongue skinks from. It's like, you're telling me that doesn't have a distinctive type of scrub python when it has a distinctive type of all these other animals. So
sure.
I don't know that. Was there anything that ever came through scrub wise that was like wow, this is blowing me away compared to what blows you away on a regular basis, seeing all the stuff that Cam brings in?
Well, see, in the first of the not a scrub, but
Sure. Anything.
the first really, well, a couple of really notable things were those first roughies before kind of the public announcement, and,
Yeah.
the
So,
year or two before, when the ones that went to Jim that then became the ones that, we would get back and stuff like that. And then there was subsequent shipments or whatever. But yeah, that was pretty wild. The Mangs, when the Mangs were coming in, were really cool.
yeah.
That Chimera annulated tree boa was a trip. That was a really neat. Again, I don't think reproducible. It was certain it didn't reproduce, but
Yeah.
and who knows, maybe, right? If it was in fact, sort of mixed. I'm not sure what I think it seemed to be a male, but anytime you're in that sort of framework, obviously there can be complications and issues.
Sure.
But yeah, a ton of cool, there'd be stuff. I got
There's no wrong
a
answer.
newborn crack monitor. Yeah,
Yeah.
a newborn crack monitor that had come in. It was just so beautiful
Yeah.
that I couldn't resist it, even at I think it was $900 or something. And then it wound up being that. So that was a really cool, captive animal. But immediately, it was like, I have no one I can sell this thing to, let alone, even if let alone at like getting plus money, or even just like, who responsibly can I sell this thing to?
Right.
You look at you and it'll just hit different for sure. Even compared to, fortunately knowing folks at Denver Zoo and things, being very up close with just born Komodo dragons, and those
Mm,
things are nothing compared to relative to the level of switch down and like,
yeah.
and that's a uh,
Yeah. No,
you know,
it is true. I mean, I've watched croc monitors exit eggs in the hands of the person sitting next to me, and I'm like, this is just they're in a league of their own. They're
yeah, it's wild.
wild.
They're just something. Big matamatas,
Mm,
like 15, 16, 17-inch long
yeah,
carapace, just massive thing. And at the same time, getting the ones that are 3 inches long, those are really cool. So
sure.
yeah, ton of awesome. And then it's always interesting, right? The stuff that was never available, right? So at that point, when I was really going out there, was before I think um, the Lanthanotis thing had kind of really taken off, and so that it would have been like, I think there had been like three that had ever come in, and they had gone to Cincinnati and died within a week, or what, they'd spent all this money and they,
Yeah,
had died rapidly and whatever. And it was like they would find them, one of them at least, this village, they're digging a latrine, and they just happened to uncover one in the process of doing it, or whatever. And that was the one of those ones that had come in. So yeah, those were things that seemed unavailable then. Now Keith is doing so well with the ones he had. They're such cool, cool animals. Those eyes are stunning. Being completely, are pretty far out there on their own thing. Awesome. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, Lisa asked a question about back to the Moluccans. The more gray one, did you were able to see what that ended up turning into as it matured?
I didn't get that one. I was thinking maybe she meant yours.
Maybe she did mean mine. Well, Lisa, if you did mean mine, and if you're still here, yeah, I mean, yeah, like the most vibrant gold you could think of on a Moluccan. It was strange. Very clean too. So, yeah, I didn't know what to think of it. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, just kind of made me question. Maybe maybe I need to hatch some out to be able to answer my own question.
Right. There you go.
Well, shoot, man, we've done over 2 hours, and I feel like we could keep going, but I feel like this is better put to a part two of a show. I really appreciate all the time and all the knowledge tonight. This has been a really fascinating episode.
Yeah, no worries at all. I've had a great time. Great talking with you. And yeah, we'll have to get out in the field.
Absolutely. So for everyone who is either watching or listening and wants to keep up with what you're doing online, where can they find you?
High Plains Herp on Instagram is the main place. I do have a Facebook that has a lot of these sort of older photos. Some of them I had posted sort of as herp history stuff on the Instagram page. If you go down far enough. For the most part now, it's just wild herps. I do have a website, rhinorats.com, that I had, had as a standard website for a long time. I've since shifted to having it be more wild photos, which is nice to not get, sometimes the compression on Facebook or Instagram, it makes it look, my photos aren't the best. I don't have the fanciest camera and whatever, but, Instagram will make it look like you colored it with crayons. So it's kind of an opportunity to put them up there, but I haven't taken advantage of that as much as I should. So I should put some time into putting some more photos on there and making that an opportunity for folks to see what it, at least closer to what I got the privilege to see. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't give the opportunity to shout the podcast out before we close up here.
Yeah, sure. So Chuck had taken a step away. So, life stuff and whatever totally makes sense. So I've been doing Reptile Fight Club with Justin Julander. And that's been, really fun. We've had a great time doing that. You were on with us, right?
Yep, I was. That was an awesome episode.
Yeah, so that's really fun. We try to do that every week. A lot of those at this point, we're trying to do kind of field herping topics just because it's super of interest to both of us. And yeah, so got lots of guest ideas and things that we're in the various process of having come out. I think all the ones we've recorded to date have come out, but hopefully we'll get one in this week, and then that'll probably be up next week or something like that, and continue on.
Hell yeah. So where can people find those episodes?
I find them on Spotify. I think they're on Apple Podcasts.
Okay.
I don't know if Eric puts we don't do the video recorded, so he might put them up on the Morelia Python Radio YouTube channel as just the audio only. I'm not sure. Okay.
Cool. Well, I would greatly encourage everyone to go check those episodes out. But again, man, thank you so much for your time tonight. If you want to stick around, I'm going to close the show out. But dude, this was awesome. I thank you everyone in the comments for, being along with us tonight. And dude, this was an awesome show.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Awesome, man. Thank you. Have a good night. All right, guys, that was an amazing episode. So much knowledge in there. My mind is spinning on some of the stuff that Rob was talking about. But yeah, incredible. So anyway, with all of that said, if you guys are still with us, thank you for tuning in either live or after the fact. If you're on YouTube, like I said at the beginning, please give us a subscribe. There is a new episode every single day here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network. So there is never... You're never at a loss of your reptile content. There's as many podcasts as there's ever been these days. So we try to put out the absolute best of the best that we can here. But yeah, if you're on the audio platforms as well, please subscribe, 5-star review, all of that good stuff. For me, you can find me on Instagram at Scrub Shepherd, Facebook, just Stephen Kush. And if you enjoyed the Scrub Talk tonight, please join the Somalia group on Facebook. That's where we have a lot of cool discussions about scrub python topics. Breeders, keepers, and people who are just interested are posting, sharing experiences. This is a community where we focus on not having any sort of gatekeeping bullshit, no drama, just love of the animals. But with all that said, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and I'll catch you all back here next week for a new episode.